Why are vintage patterns so small? And why these numbers are a deep, deep lie. Hello folks, my name is Stephanie Canada. If this is your first time with me, yes indeed, Canada is my last name. And no, I don't live there. In today's video, we're going to be discussing all types of fun things. But before we get too far into it, I do want to put a couple disclaimers on today's video. There is a portion during the regulation section where they will be racist and sizist, overtones, undertones, all across tones. So if that doesn't sound like your cup of tea, I advise you go check out one of these lovely videos where I talk about patterns, and more patterns with no disclaimers necessary. Now for a while now, I've been wondering about how and when all the patterns officially change sizes. Being a pattern seller for the better part of 10 years, I knew they changed, and my brain has been triggered that when a size 12 is a bust 30, size 12 is a bust 32, or a size 12 is a bust 34, I kind of get the idea of what era I'm looking at. However, I never really dug deeper into it until today. So this video is going to be broken up into 3 sections. The first is going to be from 1860 until roundabouts of 1941, when the very first set of standards were put out and published. The second section we'll be looking at from 1942 until roundabouts of 1983, and then we'll be discussing the third section, which is 1983 onwards, where we are what we call post-regulation, where all such, quote, regulations for standards are now gone. Because that makes sense. If one of these sections interests you more than the other, I'm going to go ahead and pop up on screen the timestamps of all of them, as well as making them chapters, so that if you want to go ahead and jump, I would advise to do so right now. Well, now that that lovely cheesy moment is over, I'm going to grab my lovely unicorn, drinking a unicorn coffee mug coffee cup, because when in doubt, let's just go meta. Thanks, Disney. And let's get started, shall we? Oh, it's rainbow. Oops. Now, we have discussed on this channel before a little bit about the history of vintage sewing patterns, but as a general glance over, in 1860, Madame Demarest came up with the very first printed tissue paper pattern. Say that 3 times fast. Followed swiftly by Butterick in 1863, McCall joined the party in 1870, Vogue in 1899, and Simplicity joined the ranks in 1927. Now, there have certainly been far other companies as well, some of which we will be touching on today, but those are our big 4 that are still around today. Now, prior to this period, you would be standardly going to a tailor or a dressmaker, having them take your measurements with all the appropriate undergarments on, and having them hand make clothing for you. But once the tissue paper pattern was invented, the whole game changed. Oh yeah, that and the home sewing machine. Because one cannot exist without the other. I mean, they could if you wanted to hand sew everything, but that's just splitting hairs. Or splitting threads. So once this period of tissue paper pattern began, you really had ladies, men's, children's, which was split up into girls and boys. Another thing to note about this video is that I will be going through and using the pronouns as they are printed on the paper pattern. That is not to exclude anyone from this conversation, but I'm just showing the pronouns as they are printed on the envelopes of the patterns themselves. I believe that you can make them for whatever gender you are, but we're going to go by what the manufacturers printed on the envelopes for this video. So when this all began, you would go by the measurements on your body. For women, the measurements were bust and hips, with an occasional waist tossed in there just for good measure. For children, you would go by age, and for men, you would either go by neck size or chest size. Now, this certainly was not a perfect way of doing it, as you will find out as we go along. I'm going to show you here a couple of examples from antique documents where you can see the sizes as they change. The oldest example I was able to find was from a McCall Bazaar magazine from the fall of 1890, describing in detail the measurements for misses and children. It shows in the diagrams how to take measurements for ladies' garments, to ensure the measure is snug but not tight, and that it isn't taken during a moment of, quote, when the bosom is expanded by a natural or forced inhalation of air. It also informs gents or boys to order from their neck measurements, and if it measures 15 inches, they should order a 16-inch collar. As you can tell, most of these were taken with the undergarments that you needed already on. So this is why a little bit of our ideal of the, quote, body size of the vintage and antique patterns are definitely skewed. And just to eliminate any type of error, the actual manufacturer would go ahead and tell you in diagram form exactly how to do it. Whereas in the 1896 example from Butterick, you didn't find any measurement laid out, by 1906 Butterick had begun to include measurements in their catalogs. They had begun to split up children, girls, and misses, but were all still based around age. A bygone brand called May Manton also clearly laid out in their sizing with similar categories and sizing to Butterick in 1906. Whereas in the Butterick 1906, a bust 40 was a waist 30 with a hip of 49.5. In May Manton 1907, a bust 40 is a waist 30 with a hip of 51. Now, one of the more interesting shifts actually happened in 1912. Pictorial noted in their fall catalog that the need to shift measurements based on the corsetry of the time. So prior to March of 1912, a bust 40 was a 28-inch waist and a 48-inch hip, and after March of 1912, it was a 40-inch bust, a 28-inch waist, and a 46-inch hip. May Manton in 1913 noted the same shift, with their changing a bust 40 from a 49-inch hip to a 46-inch hip. And by 1916, the lines had shifted once again, and now a bust 40 had a natural waist of 30 and a high waist, noted as 2 inches above the natural waist, of 31.5 and a hip of 45. And in 1918, McCall's shows a bust of 40 inches, a waist of 30 inches, and a hip of 43.5. But of course, the changes weren't done there. In the 1920s, the straighter lines and the shift away from corsetry necessitated a shift in pattern sizing once again. In 1924, we can see that a bust 40 was a waist of 32 with a hip of 44.5. And as we head into the 1930s, we see more shifting due to the undergarments of the time. And also a lot of the times we now have just notched down again to only taking measurements from bust and hips and not including the waist measurement on the patterns themselves. In 1931, we can see a bust 40 is a hip of 43, as well as in 1932 and 1934. By 1938, we have once again included a waist measurement, so a bust 40 is a waist of 34 with a hip of 43. I want to thank Mrs. Depew and Vintage For Me Too for lending me some of the photos of their antique sewing pattern catalogs. And now we've reached section 2, the time frame of regulation. This is the part where I will advise throughout this series there is a little bit of racist and sizist undertone, so please do be advised and cautious. If any of these subjects are uncomfortable for you, I would advise jumping over to this timestamp. Now, after vacillating between ages and sizes and bust measurements and different type of undergarments, the US government finally stepped in and went, hey, maybe we should do something about this. So in 1939, the US Department of Agriculture, yes indeed, that Department of Agriculture, under the Bureau of Human Nutrition and Home Economics, because that department did exist, did an extensive study along with the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, created the women's measurements for garments and pattern construction. This study was actually compiled in 1939 and it was not published until 1941. Unfortunately, this study definitely had its flaws. This study comprised of 14,698 candidates. However, due to inconsistencies and, to be frank, the biases of the people that were taking the measurements, they were downsized to a little over 10,000 measurements for this actual study. Some of the reasons being, when it was found necessary, for the sake of good feeling within a group, to measure a few women other than the Caucasian race, this fact was entered under remarks, and the schedule was later discarded. So unfortunately, this means that any of the patterns that were made under this regulation period were made primarily and solely from women that were Caucasian. A couple of the other variants of the studies meant that there was nothing really from the Midwest or Rocky Mountain region, and it primarily composed of women that were urban, single, and young mothers. Now, they of course didn't bother to ask exactly how many children they had, but still you get the point that, unfortunately, due to the fact that this was done in the late 1930s where the Depression was still in pretty much full swing, these single mothers were just desperate for any type of fee, and the participation fee did allow them a little bit of extra wiggle room, I'm sure, in their budgets. So it is definitely skewed to the younger, urban, and actually primarily working in the WPA. Even the people that wrote the study noted that while taking 10,000 measurements was a fair amount, it couldn't possibly cover all of the 40 million white women that were in the country. But nevertheless, they moved forward with what they deemed to be an acceptable study. So after this point in 1941, you do start to notice that all of the sizes tend to be a bit more regulated. Not that they weren't relatively close before, but now you actually had something from the US government that said, this is what the standard is. And most companies did adhere to it. And this size chart, while there are some outliers, it's not 100% for everything that's in the period, but it does give you a vague idea. DeBerry was the most noticeable, with larger waist sizes for the size 12 and the size 14 than the standards had given. One thing that should be noted is that companies, while they were supposed to be adhering to the standards, they might have wiggled a little bit here and there. Some of the more notable ones are Mose Royale definitely varied up until the size 18. Spada, which was billed as a designer pattern brand, had completely different measurements. While they did give you the actual measurement chart for the quote body standards, it actually did not include what the measurements on each pattern were. So for those, they actually gave you a breakdown of how to order your specific size instead of going by the general standards. Sometime in the mid-1950s, Advance published a demonstration pattern which actually showed the difference between girls, junior, teenage, and misses, as they were trying to redefine the names of each of the size runs. In 1954, you start to see Simplicity actually ratcheting down their waist sizes, especially in the size 12 and the size 14. This was because the Mail Order Association of America asked that the original data be transferred to the National Bureau of Standards to be reanalyzed. So in the late 40s to early 50s, they selected 6,500 additional women to measure, this time choosing from the Air Force. Cool. So we went from a study that relied primarily on white women that were malnourished to a study that primarily relied on white women that were severely fit. Cool. That's awesome. These additional measurements would be added in and then given to the pattern industry in 1953, adapted in 1956, and be published in 1958, creating Commercial Standard 215-58. The pattern companies did their best to update the consumer. They would include little notations at the top of their new size charts in their catalogs, as well as occasionally putting on full-page spreads to really draw attention to the fact that everything had changed. Another item they actually wanted to call attention to was that they had actually adjusted the categories of pattern as well. Most notably in my research, I had a McCall's Pattern Fashion bonus book from 1959. It shows a distinct category change between junior, misses, women's, sub-teen, teen, half-size, and petite. It gives a full chart breakdown as to what to look for in each category, as well as a breakdown of size chart for each new subcategory. There were other regulations that actually regulated just the actual clothing, not the patterns, where there were pluses and minuses, but you don't see that quite so often in an actual printed paper pattern. Now, Vogue was a little bit more subtle when it came to letting the consumers know about sub-teen, as you can only really find a mention of it in a very small blurb in the 1962 Pattern magazine. However, there was also an odd flex in the October-November 1962 Vogue pattern book. They introduced this thing called proportioned patterns, where each pattern would come with a small, medium, and large pattern inside the envelope, therefore flexing their muscle to show how different they were than the other companies. But flexing aside, we move forward, and the next time you see a really big change is going to be in late 1967 going into 1968. Officially, I believe the change happened on November 1st of 67, as there are a couple Simplicity patterns where you can see the new sizing notated in that cute little pink, bright pink notation underneath the sizing, so that folks would know,
pay attention to me!
Also known as you should probably know your measurements anyway, because that's really the best way to, buy anything when it comes to patterns. But that's neither here nor there. Looking at the chart published in 1968, we can see that the misses range has expanded, and so has the women's. Another item that shifted was some of the categories. However, and some of the more alarming changes when it came to the 60s update, I think really has to be in the denotation of chubbies. Why? Why was that necessary? This allowed folks to hopefully find better fit patterns, but the wording on it, not ideal. All under the guise of I am in the 21st century looking back into the 1968 regulations. So take that with what you will, but I really think that there could have been a better way to handle that. Now there's a part of me that wonders if during the 1960s the bra burning extravaganza might have had a little bit to do with the adjustments made in 68, because we suddenly went from a girdled and still very understructured to a free body. Just saying that might have had a little bit to do with it. But I'm sure some of the pushback of the 68 regulations also meant that it sort of begins to understand the 1970s regulations, where suddenly everything is voluntary. And we all know what big companies like to do when things become voluntary. AKA they ignore everything and do whatever they want. But the official party line is that the 1971 standards were to get closer to the, quote, off-the-rack sizes. And what I find most interesting about this time period is that from 1970 until 1983, while things were voluntary, apparently that wasn't good enough. So in 1983, all of the even voluntary regulations were finally rescinded. And now we've hit stage 3, which is post-regulation pattern companies, which oddly enough actually has sort of a gentleman's agreement between the big 4 pattern companies. Now this doesn't include any of the indie patterns, some of which I actually really do applaud for being much more size inclusive. And this gentleman's handshake was noted in an interview for Seamwork magazine. Deborah Kraling, the design development director for Simplicity Patterns at the time, had to say, "Our pattern size standard measurements have been the same since the mid-1960s. In the mid-80s, the 4 big brands regrouped and felt that there was no need to reinvent pattern sizing. As long as we were still using the same standard body measurements to create patterns, the sewing customer, at least, had something that remained true." So what exactly does that mean for when you're buying a modern day pattern? It means that those size labels don't mean dick. All of those were actually from the 1968 readjustment, when they were aligned to be more fitted with the ready-to-wear sizes of 1968. So when you're going to go buy your sewing pattern, what I have to say is, please do not worry about whatever, quote, size number is on that pattern. It doesn't matter. It doesn't. All that matters is that you know, just like in the 1860s, your bust, waist, and hip, because that is what actually matters when it comes to buying a pattern. Just take a second, wear what you would normally wear underneath it, and measure yourself. Those are actually the measurements you're going to need to buy your pattern. Please, when you go buy a pattern, please don't let these numbers actually affect you, because they literally mean nothing. They are complete garbage at this point. All that matters is that you know your measurements when you're going into the pattern shop, because that's what you actually need. Please don't let the vanity sizing of 2020 rub off onto how you purchase your patterns today, because you are a beautiful human right as you are, no matter what size, gender, ethnicity. You are wonderful, you are valued, and you are important. And that number doesn't mean anything. Off the soapbox. I did this whole video to say that. To say that I love you and buy whatever patterns you want. Just measure yourself. That's really all that matters. And on the upside, it also means that once you have those numbers and you are equipped with the actual proper knowledge, acknowledging that numbers mean nothing other than less work for you when you're sewing, it means that you can buy whatever pattern you want, whether it is modern or vintage, because nothing has changed in the past almost 50 years. And I do hope that gives you a little bit of freedom in the, oh, I don't want to hurt the vintage patterns, or oh, they were so much smaller back then. The sizes haven't really changed since 1968, so you're good. You're set. Go forth and sew and be happy. I hope y'all enjoyed that video. If you did, make sure you click the like button. Being sure to comment and tell me what pattern you're now excited to go use now that you know that pattern sizes haven't changed in 50 years. Being sure to subscribe for future pattern and sewing endeavors, and turning on the bell for post notifications so that you can actually be told when I upload a new video. If you enjoyed this video, I do have an entire playlist that I will put up right here of all of the pattern tours through the decades that I've done so far. I hope y'all have a beautiful day, and we'll see you next time. Cool, so glad my tree wants to rub on the house today. Excellent. Ooh, it feels like ages since I've done this. It's probably gonna be real orange. Since 2 of the 3 lights around me are orange. Stay! Why can't I say any of the words? We're just gonna say that, no, we're just gonna start over. Now, we've discussed on this channel before, there's a bug in here. Oh, that's annoying. Seriously, bro? Go away. Why am I so punny? My God. Because it's fun. I am so sassy because I hate the study so much. And you won't see me because I'm gonna put up a screenshot of something. Boo!